Bob Gough is Secretary of the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy and has co-chaired the National Native Peoples Climate Workshops. Osprey Orielle Lake is the co-founder and executive director of Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WeCan. She works internationally to promote resilient communities and foster a post-carbon energy future.
We've been in here at every AREDAY since the beginning, actually here before the beginning, it seems. And I've often come and talked about like the Rosebud Wind Turbine Project. We got a slide there. Looking around Indian country once with a broken arm via Google search, I found the Rosebud Wind Turbine and the long shadow it's cast over Indian country with regard to the opportunities for tribes with renewable energy. So we're looking at these kinds of technologies and have been doing so as an alternative to this. This is an 80-foot layer of lignite coal out of Wyoming. This is the alternative. This is what we're going to burn otherwise unless we get renewables on the grid. But I'm here today to talk a little bit about the indigenuity opportunities that we have here. And indigenuity is a word that one of Dan Wildcat's students came up with, compressing indigenous and ingenuity, talking about the native genius of a place and people living in relationship to place. And as we heard about the prospect of applying property rights, we're looking at the opportunities of applying intellectual property and indigenous knowledge to places where indigenous peoples are or have been. And maybe we can bring back this wisdom deeply rooted into a place and an understanding of people's relationship to place into the service of what we're doing with climate change and global warming and the like. It's that deep experiential knowledge that is capable of change and innovation, but it's coming rooted from a long experience, a deep and sustained relationship. There's more text here. I'll leave it for those who want to look at the slides later, but it's this opportunity by situating ourselves and our solutions in earth-based, local, indigenous, deep spatial knowledge. Dan Wildcat points out the comment often attributed to Albert Einstein that you can't solve the same problem with the mindset that caused it. Maybe we need to look at other mindsets, human mindsets, that have been operational in place. This is one of those opportunities we have looking at technology as a way out in terms of hard renewable energy opportunities of burying DC grid lines all across the US to protect them from terrorism, protect them from weather, protect them from solar flares, which could wipe out all of the electricity. This is an indigenous to the American psyche. This is coming from America's experience here the last 100 years or so, and it's an application that we may want to look at. But when you look at indigenous North America, you see the variety of languages and cultures, and they mirror in many ways the ecoregions. They come out of these places and are attended to and adapted to those. We're expanding that sense beyond tribal in the US to tribal and indigenous peoples throughout the territories of the US, which brings us into the Pacific and all the way to American Samoa in the southern hemisphere, a US territory, and working with the indigenous peoples there and bringing some of their insights into play. I've gone back to some of the folks in the area where my tribal descent comes from, New York City, Manhattan, the Lenape. And some of you may be familiar with that New Yorker cover from 1976. I added the wind turbines in the flyover zone to get them to think about the fact that we're looking at an entire wind shed, and we need to be working together on that kind of thing with investment coming in for renewables in the Great Plains. We've been working with Rising Voices here in Boulder in Colorado, looking at how we might apply indigenosity and indigenuity, realizing that modernity has changed the face of the earth. We've got to start applying it understanding our relationship to water and plants, a lot better our relationship to living with the materials, local materials, and living with understandings of deep past and history on the Great Plains. These predate any of the weather journals that we have from the Euro-American experience. These winter counts tell us a lot about what the weather was like on the Great Plains. We're looking at the soils. We're looking at the technologies, the techniques of how you operate food coming from the soils themselves, whether it's the breadfruit and the food forests being planted in the Pacific, or this is a tree that has been grafted with 40 different varieties of fruits. Imagine if every resident, every household had one of these in their front or backyard, and you could get a variety of fruits produced over the course of the year. And these are the ranges where that particular collection of fruits could grow. It would change both our health as well as the transport of fruit and and make us much more self-sufficient. So I wanted to put all of that out there and then turn it over to my dear friend Orielle. Osprey, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. And good morning to everyone. And again, thanks to Chip and Sally for this wonderful conference, and also, making space for the voice of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge. I want to also recognize a lot of the Indigenous women elders that have been so generous with me in sharing a lot of their information. I wish some of them were here to speak for themselves. I really want to take this short time we have to hone in on how Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights are connected to the urgency of the conversations we're having here. I think one of the most key things, and I think it's perfect that we came after the last panel concerning wildlife and the front lines of the protection of natural areas. 80% of the biodiversity that is left on the earth is in the territories of Indigenous peoples. And there's no mistake for this. Indigenous peoples have been living for millennia in harmony with the natural world. And I think that one of the things that we're losing in addition to wildlife is Indigenous languages, Indigenous lives, Indigenous knowledge that we actually need to learn from. It only makes sense that this huge library, this vast knowledge that Indigenous peoples have carried for thousands of years, that teaches us how to have good relationship with the natural world, is something that we need to learn from. Some people call it traditional ecologic knowledge, but it's also very broad in its understanding. So a couple of things that I think are important to recognize is that there is the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was passed by the United Nations. Within this, there's something called the free, prior, and informed consent, which means that you're not allowed to go on to Indigenous territories without being able to give prior consent to go onto those territories and do any action there. And of course, many governments are not paying attention to this whatsoever and violating those rights. And I think it's something that we need to look at. One, it should be enough that we're protecting Indigenous lands for Indigenous communities because they have the right to be on their traditional territories and to be able to have the way of life that they've had for thousands and thousands of years. But we also need to understand, as activists fighting for our own lives and the future of civilization, that Indigenous rights is actually key to all of us. It's one of the most important things we can do to preserve knowledge, but also a way of life for all of us and all of the creatures of life. So I think this is something we all need to learn more about and bring into the different strategies that we have, is the Indigenous rights. I think another piece that is really important, I mentioned in a talk earlier about the rights of nature. And in 2010, in the early part of 2010, after the failure of Copenhagen, there was a meeting in Cochabamba called by President Evo Morales in Bolivia. And it was the People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth. And at that meeting, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Nature was formed by Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and really is a mandate that can be put together with the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Humans to really lift up the rights of nature along with human rights, that nature has the right to thrive and grow in its own natural way and not be damaged by human activities. I think this is really important because it really came out of ancient indigenous knowledge about how to remember what indigenous people call their original instructions, meaning how do you live in good relationship with the earth. Within this context, again, and it's important to say this is not theoretical, in the United States there's been many cases, over 120 cases of community rights that implement rights of nature into communities to stop fracking, to protect natural systems, to protect waterways. And the country of Bolivia in 2010 was the first country in the world to put rights of nature into their constitution. Bolivia also has rights of nature laws. And I mention this because in addition to this, one of the things that happened in Ecuador that was really interesting is along with rights of nature being put into the Constitution, they also put into the Constitution something called sumak kausai, which is, for lack of a better way of translating it, something that means living well. And it's an ancient cosmovision of indigenous people of Ecuador, which really talks about not just how we treat nature in a respectful way, but about reciprocity around our economy. It's a full vision of the fact that we're part and particle of the community of life, that nature is not the subject of rights, that nature actually is a rights-bearing entity. So it's a very full spectrum understanding. And one of the things I think politically that's really interesting about Sumak Kausai, or this idea of Buen Vivir, is in the Global South, it's really a political movement. And it's indigenous peoples, but also activists and people working in social justice movements in the Global South to say we need a different understanding of progress. Our idea and our modern idea and Western notions of progress, in other words, the bottom line and being able to always have a profit be the reason we do everything, is not working out so well for us. These market mechanisms as a solution to the climate crisis, to saving biodiversity, is not enough. We actually need to change our worldview and understanding of how, as in many ancient cultures, that you give and take with nature, that you give offering to nature, that it's not just about taking from nature. And I think this is also really important because there's a lot of understanding that how we're going to get to solutions right now in terms of speed and scale is through making profit on different technologies. And while I support that in some regard, I think we need to be very, very critical that that is not the only solution. We also need to understand that our worldview is paramount to going through this very small keyhole out the other side to living in sustainability. And I think there's a lot to learn from indigenous knowledge about this. And I'm just going to close with a quick story. Sure. Is that okay? And then I'm going to hand this back to you because maybe you have a final comment as well. One of the things that was really moving to me when I was in Paris is that there were so many indigenous people who did incredible actions during COP21. And I think they were some of the strongest street actions, some of the strongest voices, some of the most potent knowledge came out of the indigenous peoples who were there fighting for indigenous rights. It's very unfortunate that in the end, indigenous rights were removed from the operative part of the Paris Agreement. I think it's a giant mistake. I think it's something that we're going to have to write in a different way since that didn't happen in the Paris Agreement. But there was an incredible action that happened one day on one of the tributaries to the Seine River. It was a flotilla action by all the indigenous people. And they were in their canoes and their kayaks coming down the river with beautiful song and demonstrating and saying that we need to have indigenous rights in this agreement for all the reasons I was just mentioning. And there was a beautiful press conference that happened afterwards with all indigenous peoples. And one of the things that really moved me was a woman from Sariaco in Ecuador, an indigenous woman who's been fighting and putting her body on the line, as many indigenous people do, to protect these forests for all of us, for all of the future of all of humanity. And I'm sure she did not have had an opportunity to do a lot of press conferences coming from deep in the jungle of Ecuador. And I love what she said. She got up in front of this press conference. There was, at least 100 different journalists there. And she said to the audience, we women are here to protect the sacred living systems of nature. And we can do anything. We carry our babies on our backs through the jungle. We are descendants of the jaguars. We can run through the jungle with our babies on our backs at night. We can do anything. And I love that she said that because to me, one, just the strength that we are going to have that energy that we can do anything at this really critical, difficult time. And also talking about the fact that her people are descendants of the jaguar, and to remember our connection to nature, which I think Indigenous people really remind us of, that, to really go through this difficult time, we're gonna have to stay very grounded in nature. Remember, we're from the stars, that the plants and the animals, the forests are our living relatives, and that this is not just conceptual or theoretical, this is part of our heritage. And to remember that, and having the strength of nature as we really fight nature, that we are part and particle of nature, that we're not here just to defend nature, but that we are part and particle of nature. Thank you.
And with that, I'll leave it with a closing thought. As we talk constantly about rights, Indigenous peoples understand that we have unalienable rights, but with those come unalienable responsibilities. And we rarely talk about those responsibilities. So as we see Paris taking rights, Indigenous rights, out of the picture, they're not even going in the right direction to think about that next step of how do we exercise, be allowed to exercise our unalienable responsibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.